Welcome to Citizens Insight, the Citizens Party's interview series on matters of national and international importance. Today, how Kiwis fought back against the private bank cartel and won. The story of New Zealand's post office Kiwibank. And for this discussion, I'm joined by a very special guest, Matt Robson, a former government minister of New Zealand, who was there, whose party was instrumental in setting up New Zealand's Kiwibank. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you. It's a very pleasure to be on your program.
Well, Matt, regular viewers of the Citizens Party's shows, like the Citizens Report and Citizens Insight, will know that we are in a big campaign to get a postal bank in Australia, which is why once I got to know you, I was very excited to have this discussion because you did it. Your country has a postal bank, and it came about because of some, intense political efforts to get a postal bank up. And I think this is something that the Australian public will benefit from your experience in learning about. But there's a whole history to this, though, which I think is important to provide the context that we should go through. So before we do, though, let's just tell us a little bit about yourself, including the fact that although you were a New Zealand government minister, you're actually an Aussie.
Well, that's one of my admissions that I have to give to New Zealand audiences, that not only was I a lawyer, not only did I come from the largest city, Auckland, which is universally despised by the rest of New Zealand, probably the same way that Sydney and Melbourne are, but that I was also an Australian. That would often get the loudest, I must say, good-natured boo.
Right.
But yes, my Australian heritage is important to me. I came here as a teenager with my parents. They went back to Queensland, where I come from, where I was born. But I married and stayed here, and it's been my life since then. And I guess I'll be carried out of here feet first at some stage. So, yeah.
And you were a Labor Party activist, from a fairly young age? I think you got involved in politics around the war.
After coming from Australia, I went at the age of 17 to university. And the background of that, my father had been a AIF veteran in the Middle East on the Kokoda Trail, and he was absolutely terrified. I was his only son. He did love his daughters, but I was the one at a time when there was conscription for Vietnam, and he was totally against the war in Vietnam. He wanted me to stay here. So off I went to the University of Auckland, and I joined the Labor Party as probably the most left-wing party at that stage on the campus, and was a member, have been on and off, including some periods of where we've parted ways, which we will come to when we discuss the bank. But yes, many, many years now I was in the Labor Party.
All right, well, let's get into the economic issues then that lead to the bank policy. This is a theme that our party has worked very hard to educate Australians on and essentially remind Australians of a certain generation about. But we had a public bank in Australia. You had a public bank in New Zealand. These public banks were operating for decades and decades and decades. But then in the late 1970s and 1980s, a neoliberal economic wave swept the world, right? The Western world especially. Margaret Thatcher was at the vanguard of it. You, as a person who was very much involved in politics at the time, a leading activist in the party, I think you were even working towards being a candidate for office. What can you say? What are your observations about how this wave of neoliberalism affected your country and your party?
It affected it dramatically. And Australia and New Zealand have common histories, both colonies of Great Britain, both settler colonies, both have a tragic history in terms of the indigenous people. But our labour movements are very similar, and there's been a cross-fertilisation, I guess, between the two countries. The first leader of the New Zealand Labour Party was Harry Holland, who was Australian militant, a very fine man. And later on, the first Prime Minister in 1935, Joseph Savage from Victoria. So there's been a cross-fertilization and a sharing of the history. And the setting up after the Second World War, particularly after the experience of the Great Economic Depression of the 30s, gave the impetus in both countries to deepen and establish a welfare state and a greater sharing of wealth. I won't go into that, but laying that basis for a progressive taxation system, being able to have free education, health, better employment laws, and so forth. Steps forward for humanity, in my opinion, and the opinion, of course, of many of our party members. And then in the 80s, an enormous setback. New Zealand often credits itself for being ahead of the world in good things. Like 35 was when we first started, the first Labor government put in the steps, very progressive steps for a welfare state. So got in there before Australia. But then in 1987, we passed the legislation that says no nuclear weapons in New Zealand, and it pulled us out of, well, we were sacked by the United States from ANZUS. So New Zealanders have often talked about being in the advance of the world and progressive steps, and that's true. But the one thing we were advancing, but it wasn't progressive, was the acceptance of Thatcherism, Friedman, the right-wing ideas. Was basically to smash the welfare state, smash the question of making societies more equal, so that all of our citizens had a better grounding in the life experiences to come. And 1984 was the pivotal year because it was an election of a Labor government, which will come to the role of the bank. The leader of my party, who had been the president of the Labor Party, Jim Anderton, he played a pivotal role in that 84 election after a long period of conservative rule. And I think Australia had the Labor government 83. And the program put out was to deepen the role of the state as an enabler of its citizens in the economy, in social provisions, and particularly to use the state alongside private enterprise, working in the regions, because the regions had declined for a very long time economically. There were disparities between the regions, something you'd be familiar with in Australia. And you needed particularly the state to play a leading role in ending that disparity, or at least lessening it. So 84 was a straightforward social democratic program to deepen the move towards a more equal society. But the leaders of the Labor Party, Parliamentary Labor Party, had other ideas. They openly admitted it later on that they were going to just crash their way through with the right-wing program. So it was a classic right-wing program, absolutely in opposition to what they'd been elected on, a complete betrayal of the Labor Party membership and of the country. So small government, sell all the assets, drop the taxation rates on income on the highest income earners. They slashed them by a half, actually, and talked about the trickle-down effect, which people have said rather crudely that it's actually urinating on the poor, trickle down.
Yep.
And all the classic steps that you'd say, privatize, reduced income tax on the wealthiest people, and so forth. So the complete program was brought in a rush, and New Zealand was stunned. The Labor Party was stunned. Jim Anderton had been the president up until 84, but then he went into Parliament as a very well-known New Zealander. And he and a group of about 11 of a very big Labor Party caucus, because they'd had a massive win in the 84 election, said, hey, this is not what we were elected on. And straight away, it happened straight away. So by 85, the division was there between the cabinet under a man called Roger Douglas, was the economic minister, and David Lange, who was well known for his advocacy of being nuclear-free New Zealand. Although I must tell you that until he was pushed, he was he was taking the same type of role that we see, unfortunately, your Prime Minister and mine taking it in international affairs. He didn't want it. But anyway, he did later on front up on this question. But the savage policy already worked out to change New Zealand in the direction of what was called the Round Table, who were connected to the Mont Pelerin Society, to all that they had worked very hard to put this program. Most New Zealanders did not understand. In fact, I can't even say that I understood it at that moment, 84, as to where it was headed. But we at least had the advantage of studying these things and getting ready for a counterattack. But I'll come back to the point that the key issue politically was the Parliamentary Labour Party. It was there that you needed to make a stand.
Yep.
Unfortunately, the four leaders of this charge, called TINA, there is no alternative, have to sell off all state assets, have to privatize, reduce government, introduce user pays everywhere. They had the power to go to the members of parliament and basically say, you want to be in the cabinet? You want a trip abroad? You want whatever they were offering them. And the majority of them collapsed. We in the party were shocked. It was the first experience that I'd had of mass betrayal. Older members of the time probably remember other periods, and particularly in Australia, with what happened in the Australian Labor Party in the 30s under the Scullin government and onwards, and then later on the DLP, you perhaps had more grounding in this mass type of betrayal of policies and programs than we had. But there was about 11 members of parliament with Jim Anderton. By the end of 1985, there was one, or there were actually two. There was another chap who was called Landslide. He won by one vote and won his seat. So he also had the name Landslide. But effectively, there was only Jim Anderton left. It was such a massive political lesson for myself and my generation of Labour Party activists. And as you said, I was a leading party activist. I was in a seat that was a Labour stronghold, and I could have had a career to go into Parliament.
Matt, what you're describing sounds almost like an economic coup, a takeover of government, especially if your campaign was completely the opposite of that. This is quite extraordinary. Now, I did a research project on New Zealand in the 1990s and looked into how all this came about, and I really wish we had the time. We could spend hours talking about this. This question of the Mont Pelerin Society, I remember what we were able to identify was this round table that you referred to. And for the sake of the audience, the Mont Pelerin Society is a think tank that was set up, actually funded by the Bank of England and the British government in 1947 in Switzerland, a place called Mont Pelerin. And it was a think tank dedicated to right-wing economics to undermine the new consensus that had formed around Franklin Roosevelt, Ben Chifley in Australia, Clement Attlee in the UK, New Zealand Labor, etc., that you needed to have the government needed to function in such a way as to serve the real economy, serve the welfare of people. And they set out to undermine this, and Thatcher became their great champion 30 years later. What they also did is they spread these think tanks around the world. And there was one of the Sir Anthony Fisher, his name was, this British leader, co-founder of the Mont Pelerin Society, took it upon himself to do this, and it's called the Atlas Network of think tanks, and they were put everywhere, including in Australia and New Zealand, and the Round Table was one of those. The New Zealand Treasury, Matt, became a stronghold of this neoliberal thinking, but clearly. So just two things I want you to comment on. Do you have a view whether Roger Douglas was just sort of taken over by the Treasury officials and told what to do, or whether there'd been a program of courting him by the Business Roundtable to get him into this frame of mind, in which case his whole campaign would have been dishonest in 1984. So I'd like your thoughts on that. But also, if you can describe the economic impact that these policies started to have, I think that's really crucial.
Okay. I should have said, I'll start with the economic impacts. it stunned the country. We had no unemployment in New Zealand, very, very low unemployment. And then suddenly there was this unemployment, and generations had not known what it meant to lose jobs and housing.
Hold that thought, Matt. In our research project, we read through all the New Zealand statistical yearbooks, and in this all the way up to the 70s, New Zealand unemployment did not have a percentage rate. It was counted, I think maximum 200 people were unemployed in the whole country. It didn't even rate as a percentage.
A Conservative Prime Minister used to boast that he could ring up each of the unemployed. He knew them by name. And it's true. In fact, may I say that one of the reasons that brought my father from Australia, there was a recession. When he came, he had a job, but he thought, well, there's better prospects in New Zealand. And he was staggered when he came to New Zealand, as my mother was. Education was totally free. Health was totally free. Prices were low. Rents were cheap. But full employment, you opened the paper and there were jobs. Suddenly, it went and people faced with unemployment. Whole towns closed, whole industries that were the freezing works, railways, others. Change, people were happy to discuss change, but there was no thought of any transition, planning for it. If one industry was to go out, sunset industry or whatever the cause, a responsible government would plan for those workers and those communities to have alternatives. Yeah. Nothing like that, because the right-wing policies, and I'll come to the question about Roger Douglas and people, was you have a shock. It was shock and awe. We got used to that in terms of the Iraq War and America putting that forward as shock and awe. Well, this was shock and awe. And they said, there's going to have to be pain. Of course, the pain was always on the bottom. Yeah. It wasn't on these people. They had these catchphrases. We have to have the pain. We have to sacrifice. Never was a question of them sacrificing, that they benefited, particularly with the drop in taxation. Suddenly, you're getting $200 or $300. This is $84. So it'll be a lot more now in their hands a week, that the people who least needed it, but the people on the bottom were cut. But you'll understand that happening. Yeah. So it was a tremendous shock. Farms were closed. Farmers walked off their properties. Suicides rose. Youth unemployment. And of course, as in your society, the people hit the hardest were Maori, Pacific, women, European descended workers as well, but the usual thing. So back to Roger Douglas. Roger Douglas and some of his academic advisors, in fact, one of them, Professor Holt, had been a lecturer of mine. He'd been a very left-wing lecturer. Though in the 80s, these people that I was used to, and the guy called Bassett was one of my university lecturers. He was a key member of the Douglas cabal in the parliament. They went from being ostensibly left-wing and socialist and thoughtful to this new position. How they came to it, I can't say. I wasn't in their circle, but I would think they probably all influenced each other. I know that Holt studied at Chicago, and so he came back with a lot of this material and thoughts. But they were actually easy to buy. It isn't hard sometimes to. It's one thing it's taught me in life. Don't just look at what people say. Look at what they do. Have a think about where they really are situated. And so with Roger Douglas, and you pointed out the Treasury, yes, the top levels of government were in on this. They stepped in and out. When I'm studying American politics, it's often comment made how quickly people move from General Motors into the administration or one of the others, BlackRock or Halliburton, whatever, backwards and forwards from the administration. Yeah. Well, it's not quite like that in New Zealand because of the public service situation and that, but it's pretty much like that, where the Treasury, the Round Table, and the Reserve Bank, and everybody appointed on the boards, they're all in each other's pocket. They're all the 1%, as the term perhaps it sums it up for a lot of people. And that's what happened in New Zealand. But their plan, it was a very detailed plan. It was almost like Operation Barbarossa under Hitler. I mean, they had it down to a thing. And the only thing that stood in there, because people were shocked and stunned, they were quite right. But they really also relied on Douglas's cynicism to the top people. Don't worry that we're the Labour Party, because many of the people he's working with who are they obviously were conservative, but they're intelligent people, and they knew that it was better to use the Labour Party because that was what confused people.
Yeah.
Here's the party of the people. People forgot what the name Labour meant, having formed a party to oppose the old landed parties. We called them the Liberal Party in the old days, so you've still got the name, the different conservative parties, and to form a party to represent all the producers in the country, all the people who contribute. So the cynicism was there. Use the Labour Party as the instrument, and then get the members of Parliament. That's big. We're talking about the bank, but we're also moving on to how politics works and what we have to be aware of, and what is required of the representatives of the people. But the biggest shock to me was how easy it was to buy off in different ways, sometimes for a very small price, a trip abroad, the promise of a promotion. All of the Labour MPs, except one, Jim Anderton.
Well, I want to ask you about Jim now, but let me just preface by saying this. I want viewers to be aware, because we certainly highlight this on our show. You're talking now about the early 80s, the early to mid 80s. It's now more than 40 years later, right? Or it's 40 years later, and 40 years later we can look back and recognise and acknowledge that what the changes that were rung in then, with all the promises that we were told, haven't worked. It's been a disaster. And so these observations of yours are quite instructive, because yes, this is what we're going to be up against in fighting back to go back to policies that actually worked, right? I argue they didn't get rid of things like public banks because they didn't work. They got rid of them because they did work. These were institutions that were in the way of this agenda to be able to concentrate, create an economic system where these elite can loot. The business roundtable, from our research, and I remember doing the flow chart on this, the business roundtable mapped out this agenda that Roger Douglas implemented, including this mass privatisation program, which preceded Australia's, and then 80% of the assets that were privatised were bought at fire sale prices by members of the business roundtable. Right? This was a wealth grab in New Zealand, and it's a really dramatic one, but what happened in Australia, what happened in Russia, what happened in Italy, what happened in other countries where you had big privatisation programs as well, was exactly the same thing, but the New Zealand one is particularly instructive. I also remember we found this quote from Roger Douglas when he was involved in a think tank based here in Melbourne called the Tasman Institute, Matt, which was named after the fact that Australia and New Zealand, of which he was on the board, as well as Rupert Murdoch. And tell me in what universe a true Labor person would ever be on a board with Rupert Murdoch, right?
And Tony Blair.
That's right. And Roger Douglas, though, actually made this frank admission. He said, when we sold all these assets, we used the excuse of paying down government debt, but that was never the reason for it, right? He actually acknowledged it was virtually a boast later on. And that brings me, though, to the privatisation that leads to this discussion today. So you raised Jim Anderton, and I find what's fascinating about Jim Anderton is, unlike in Australia, you had someone in the New Zealand Labor Party in the Parliament who took a stand on this to the point where he eventually split from the party. There was no equivalent in Australia when Bob Hawke and Paul Keating started doing exactly the same things here that you described there. Nobody in the Labor Party in Australia took a stand like that. Old-timers who were no longer in the party were severely critical of it, but the actual party didn't. But in New Zealand you did, and it was in the form of the late Jim Anderton. Now, he took a stand over the privatisation of the Bank of New Zealand, New Zealand's public bank. So what can you tell us about why he took the position he did on that issue?
Well, he understood the centrality of the bank, which was a nationalised bank. In fact, I think it was nationalised the same year that Chifley brought in the 1945 Commonwealth Bank Act in Australia. New Zealand nationalised the Bank of New Zealand. And it played a significant role. At the time it was privatised, it was the bank which dominated about 20% of the whole financial sector, and was available to assist not just in the usual banking activities, which just to make profit, but in social and economic development throughout the country, it was an important part of the toolkit of any government to act on behalf of its people. And so it was necessary to knock it off, to steal it. You've mentioned what happened in Russia and other places with fire sales. Well, that's what happened in New Zealand. The rail service, which was built by the country, no private company could have built the rail system. $1 it was sold to the American company which bought it. $1 for the tracks. They paid other for the I mean, it's just ridiculous. And the Bank of New Zealand was valued at probably $4 billion in 1884 New Zealand dollars, a parity of Australia, about almost the same. $4 billion, and no one in the private marketplace could buy that. Jim Anderton said in one of his speeches, well, if someone's got 4 billion, even a left-wing person like me might think, okay, we'll take the 4 billion. But what he was trying to point out was that the private sector wanted it for a song, and they got a key financial institution for a song, and then they hocked it off to others. So it was sold offshore anyway. So it meant not just a public bank went, which was most important, more than even the fact that it's owned by New Zealand capitalists, but it was also sold off to the international market. And this, you were talking about the international connections, Murdoch and all the other figures around the world involved with this. Yes, we once had the labor movement had internationals around the world to work together. People in different countries don't go to war with each other, cooperate. Well, so do these people at a very high level, which you often don't know about. And they had their eyes on the assets of New Zealand too. So they were encouraging, supporting, building, and using it. And with the bank at the time, forget exactly what it was sold with, those comments of Roger Douglas about paying down debt as an excuse. When it was sold in 84, there were 87, sorry, it was sold, 88 was sold. 87, we had the big stock market crash in both countries. And the debt that the bank had then was no worse than it had when it was sold. I mean, in fact, there wasn't a debt. I got myself mixed up there. The bank, even in the worst time, was returning an enormous amount of money to the government. So what was done was got rid of an important economic tool, which could have worked in with other financial instruments of the government, like Development Finance Corporation, which was also sold. But the bank just lost its ability to be in this economic toolkit. So you ask what Jim Anderton, well, he was a man of principle. He was a man of honor. I've known him for 40, 50 years. I was much younger I was younger than him. And what I saw was the people I knew, like Helen Clark, Phil Goff, my generation, went to university with them. They capitulated. I was expecting them to be in the forefront. And then I saw them when they were offered cabinet posts. I don't know what other motivated them. Perhaps intellectually they convinced themselves. But Jim Anderton said, this is dishonest. This is wrong for both our party and the country. And I will not have a bar of it. You can do what you like. Because you see, he was threatened. I'll tell you what he was threatened with. If you keep this up, you will not get any overseas trips. Okay, members of parliament like overseas trips. He laughed at them. No, I want to stay in New Zealand and campaign for decent policies. So you couldn't buy the man. You couldn't buy him, but the others could be bought. I don't necessarily mean money handed over in a paper bag, but preferment. They look ahead to their future. They're willing to sell it. So Jim Anderton became a central figure for all of us. But without him and his mana in the country, he was so well known, and the trust in him, because the population, they saw that the parties on either side, the Conservatives or Labour, broke their promises and didn't stand by the people, but that Jim Anderton did. And there's a famous cartoon, be worth you getting, where the Labour Party caucus, because you said Jim Anderton split them. No, they expelled him from the caucus for voting for the policy. The policy of the party was not to sell the Bank of New Zealand. That's different from the parliamentary party, which then sold it.
So he voted for the party's policy in opposition to the parliamentary party,
Yes, the
And
Constitution says that the party policy prevails over the parliamentary party.
And they expelled him for that.
They expelled him. So this cartoon shows Jim Anderton with I forget, probably Lungi as the Prime Minister, pointing into the wilderness with you. But out in the wilderness was the population of New Zealand.
Oh, okay.
And there's Jim Anderton going out into the population. So it reminds me of that, Bertolt Brecht, the public, something like the public are revolting. We have to get a new, the people are revolting. We need new people.
Well, if someone had have done the same thing here in the 90s and taken a stand and opposed the sale of the Commonwealth Bank, that person would be universally revered today because they would have been vindicated by that for that opposition, given subsequent events. And I suppose the same is true for New Zealand. Jim Anderton's stance was subsequently vindicated by the economic developments and the public?
Yes, they certainly were, because when we then later on became the party called, New Labour Party, forming with three other small parties, became the Alliance, many of these policies reversed, certainly the public asset sales, but much of it had gone by then, and also an unfair taxation system. I mean, our GST, we don't have it, our tax on regressive tax isn't like Australia, where, when I've been there, some things are exempt. Our tax is now 15% on everything from basic staples through to education, whatever. So the poor pay that, or workers pay that. Yeah. But yes, there's a success story coming if we get to as part of your interview.
Well, okay, you say that Jim Anderton was expelled, but would it be fair to say that because he was expelled, you and others like you actually split from the party to join with Jim Anderton? And then when did you take up the campaign for a public bank that later became Kiwibank? What made that such an important part of your policy platform in this breakaway?
Well, so many things made it important, but as you pointed out, so we formed a new party, and I gave up my hope of to be a Labour MP under the Labour banner, which was, people said to me, "Oh, you're very brave, you're very courageous." I said, "No, Jim Anderson's the courageous one. He hasn't taken the piece of sauce that you offered him, and we're following him. He's the person that guides us in this, and we stand with him." Interesting enough, and I'll come straight to your question, I don't mean to go away from it, but many of the people who spoke up and said, "We're with you, Jim, we're going with you," particularly, unfortunately, because I worked for a trade union as a young lawyer at that time, many of the trade union leaders also found it was more comfortable to be with the government. They were offered things, and they were all ready to go, and they were going to fight to the last breath, except they had a few more breaths and they didn't fight, and they capitulated. So Jim, when he went out, was pretty much without resources, without these blowhards who said they would stand with him. But certainly ordinary Labour Party members deserted the party or left the party and joined us in droves. So it was quite a phenomenon. But the reason for the bank, we actually took a lot of the old Labour Party policy. Much of the policy we had went forward in '84, which was betrayed, in particular regional and economic development, which meant a coordinated, concerted use of all government agencies, powers of the state, alongside community organizations, businesses in those areas, to develop good planning in each of the regions to lift them up and use their advantages. And central to that was any financial tools. And part of that key financial tool, of course, was a public bank which wasn't, as the shareholders of all the private banks once, what is the interest of their shareholders? Well, the shareholders of the publicly owned bank were the whole population, and it was their interest that would be served. And so that, we were part of this, I know it's part of what you've been concentrating on, were the closure wholesale of banking branches throughout the country. They were just decimated, and people had no services. And this is before the excuse that technologically we've moved on from having face to face. This was when you needed a bank for every every particular service, to drawing money to depositing. So it was a fable then, it's a fable now.
And these were by then mostly Australian-owned banks, right? Your banks
Yes,
are our
the
banks.
Bank of New Zealand soon passed into private Australian hands, and beyond that to the rest of the world. And there were 5 banks at that time. National later, I think, joined with the Bank of New South Wales and whatever became the ANZ.
Westpac.
Oh, Westpac, yeah. But they were all privately owned, and they rigged there was no competition. There were cartels, so fees just went through the roof. So ordinary people were paying for this, paying for that. You've had a Royal Commission which has exposed so many of these practices. Well, that was in New Zealand as well, because the same banks in Australia were doing the same things here, and just their profits were gargantuan. So you needed any government, left, right, or centre, with a brain would say, hey, we can't control monetarization, we can't control the economy, we can't plan for a decent society if we do not have a bank which could compete with these people. And the Bank of New Zealand had been that bank. It used to return, and forget the numbers now, but an enormous amount, over $500 million in 84, 86, $87. And of course, the other thing about a bank which is publicly owned, it doesn't have an incentive to avoid tax. All yours.
That's right.
All those Australian-owned banks. I stress not just Australian, because you could have a New Zealand bank which raids into Australia. There's plenty of New Zealand companies go into Australia and strip them when they're allowed to, and do the same type of things. These people have no conscience, no country. It's a publicly owned bank, which is the important thing. It has no incentive to lower its taxation. It wants to give the government as much as it can. And it's there in perpetuity, in good times and bad. And that's what you need in any sensible, rational economic policy.
Do you remember why, when and why you decided that the best vehicle would be the post offices?
Well, actually, the initiative came from the post offices themselves. We had been discussing abstractly, all of us, it's not a public bank, and so we should just say it. And then as you get closer and closer to government, I mean, Jim was the most experienced of all of us, so he'd been thinking a long time, how do you do it? What are the nuts and the bolts? For some of the younger ones at that time, it was a little bit, we just put the slogan up and it'll happen, like Father Christmas coming. But then we started to focus once we became MPs. 93, we had Jim and one of our leaders, Sandra Lee, under the old Pass the Post. 96 was different because Australia, of course, with its preferential system, was a little bit advanced to us at that stage in terms of being able to, but MMP, proportional representation, was a big game changer in 96. But when we had more MPs, we were focusing, and the discussions came from within the Post Bank itself. We'd been aware, but perhaps not as much as later, what a network there was. And, if we looked outside, weren't so insular in New Zealand, and looked outside to places like Germany, which had been using this system for a very long time, and other countries, it was there to be looked at and successful, and you could learn from it. So the Post was faced with the problem of declining number of letters as new technology came in and a drop. So they sensibly sat down as the Brains Trust and said, why don't we, because there used to be a post office savings bank that was privatized as well. So the Post had experience at being a bank. When there was a split between trading and savings, they were the post office savings bank and the bank of choice of the New Zealand working class. They're in their area, in their doing, they could be trusted, they were government backed. They had a name. So there were various people who came in. Interesting enough, someone who was head chair of the Post board, been a former president of the National Party, our Conservative Party. But he had a brain in his head, he had a conscience, and he saw that what Labor was doing in his own party, it was previous party, was not in the interest of the country, and that the Post service could become a banking, and that it sprang from there, and now seems like common sense, but it wasn't at the time.
All right, that's great the way that came about. So in 1999, Matt, your alliance entered into a coalition government with Helen Clark's Labor Party. And that is somewhat thanks to the proportional representation system that New Zealand adopted. But also, how much do you attribute your success to the banking policy and the campaign you had?
Oh, enormously. It was one of the key things in all of our earlier on. We called it 93. We had a 93 election. We didn't succeed in getting many members of parliament in, but we laid the basis. And we ran back in 1990 as the New Labour Party. And we had, abstractly. But by 1999, we could refine it. We didn't have the name at that stage, Kiwibank.
Yeah.
I'll explain how that came about. But public bank, it was actually called Jim's Bank everywhere. Oh, we're voting for Jim's Bank. And that's all you had to say. Do you like Jim's Bank? And any meetings, we had big meetings, 300, 400, 500 people, maybe bigger in some of them, union meetings, community meetings, the usual thing. And it was one of the most popular because it actually affected people's lives. The very thought they could go down to their local bank. And also, there was a little bit of chauvin. I used to try and counter the sort of that chauvinism stuff. I don't quite like it. I don't mind the name Kiwibank, but it needs to have Kiwi publicly owned bank because you can soon turn a Kiwibank into, this is owned by Mr. or Mrs. Moneybags, but they're Kiwis. Well, yes, but they spend their holidays in St. Moritz or on the Gold Coast. There's no loyalty amongst thieves.
No.
But it's extremely popular, but also integrated. We had a very detailed, bit like your party, which attracts me to what you do. You put out the facts, you put out research. You can be wrong, but people can argue on the facts, not ad hominem.
Yeah.
We had detailed policies, and Jim was a stickler for that. He said, don't tell the people lies. Stand by your policies. And in fact, it harmed us because when we said you want free education, you want free health brought back, this is what the taxation has to be. We worked out a detailed taxation policy, which actually benefited the lower people. But the right wing and the Conservatives and the Labour Party hammered us with it. The party was going to raise taxes. They always left out that it was taxes on those who'd had them dropped by 30, 40%, not on the lowest people, plus the return of having free education, free health, public housing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and a growing economy. It wasn't just tax and spend, you can do that, but a detailed plan for regional development. And that comes back to the bank. We wanted the bank not just to be, it wanted to be successful, but also to work further in terms of social and economic development throughout the country.
Well, let's talk about that in a minute when we talk about how it's actually performed. But still, there's a great story here about how you actually got it. Because once you're in government, you're in a coalition with the Labor Party. So how supportive was the Labor Party for the policy, and what did it actually take to get it up?
They were as supportive as, I think it was Lenin who said, the rope that supports a hanging man. Complete hostility. So we were kissing cousins once again. I mean, it's a small country, 5 million people. Everybody knows everybody, goes to their barbecues, went to university with them or worked with them or whatever they did. So, that's that. But still, the policies were very different. But one good thing, I'll just come on that for Labour, their right wing under Douglas had split off into another party called ACT, which stands for Association of Consumer and Taxpayers, which tells you everything about that you want to know about them. That's their view of politics.
No one's a citizen anymore.
Yeah, that's right.
Consumer or taxpayer? Taxpayer.
So Labor had backed off from it. First, it had its membership demanded no dropping the tax rates on the richest people, no more asset sales. But they were, as a party, saying, well, we might have been wrong to do it the way we did, but you had to change, as though there was only one way of changing, which was the crash and bang theory. But we had an agreement with them, and including on foreign policy, which is something dear to my heart, not to be involved in military alliances around the world, or the ones that we didn't want. So there was a lot of agreement, and the public backed us. And in fact, it was a little bit to our detriment because a lot of people, Labor Party's been around a long time, and they said, "Oh, Labor's coming home." The alliances helped them, but anyway, Jim's attitude was always doesn't matter. The policies are matter. Whatever the vehicle, we push the policies. That's our legacy. That's our important legacy. So back to this. Well, Helen Clark and Michael Cullen were famously, even when we got the bank, to go on television and say, well, we're not joining. We're staying with like the BNZ or wherever they had. And they were sour about it right through. Helen's had the good grace to admit she was wrong. But they fought tooth and nail against it. And on their side was the Treasury still. I mean, we hadn't executed these people. These villains were still there, We didn't have the power to take them out, send them off to a gulag. But they were still there. They were still fighting the battle of the 80s.
Yeah.
And they were disloyal. I'll tell you, the dirty tricks were everywhere. And what was the weapon we had? The people, including the Labour Party branches. So into the Labour Party cabinet and MPs came the recommendations and resolutions of ordinary Labour Party branches. We want Jim's bank. Now, they set their face against that because they're experienced at staring down their own members. But because when the asset sales were on, the Post Bank, Bank of New Zealand, the Railway, Air New Zealand, the whole lot, 90% of polls said don't sell. And they sold. I thought people will get over it, particularly if we offered them shares, mum and dad shares. But so back to this time, well, so I was, the cabinet, we bought this was a flagship policy. They had it in front of them. We said, we want our bank. So a committee, you set up a committee, which Jim was on, and there was Michael Cullen as the treasurer and the other key ministers, the finance ministers, and Jim. There were four of us in cabinet, myself, Lila Hurry, Sandra Lee, and Jim. So Jim was our person. There were three of them because we strategized, of course. And what Jim did was he always did, he put the facts on the table and said, what do you think of this fact? Cross that one off. What do you think of this fact? Cross that one off. And he had the support of the New Zealand Post board. Well, most of them. There was a number of traitors in there, and they went out and leaked stuff and went in. There was a complete campaign against the bank by the establishment, which the Labour Party bought into. And then I remember one pivotal meeting in the cabinet where we had a vote on it, and the vote went 16 against us, 4 for us. And our members were getting edgy. A lot of them wanted to go and pick at the banks and do all sorts of things. And Jim cautioned, no, he said, we're in government. You don't have to do that. We'll put the pressure on them by the facts, and we've got the country with us. So just take your time. Part of his wisdom, again, political wisdom. He knew they'd have to back down. And eventually they did. There's a famous meeting, which you know about, where final cabinet meeting on this, where Jim went through, once again, every single argument against the bank and absolutely demolished it, including particularly on the financial side, which they always pulled out. It'll be a failure. The government will have to keep putting money into it. So he showed what the fact that they had a network, as you're talking about, a post bank network, already flying start, because you don't even have to put that up. You need an investment, surely, but you're looking at a return of your investment. Using their language, what's going to be a good return? Well, we could show a good return. So finally, after a very, very long marathon session, Michael Cullen, still holding out as the treasurer, one of the ministers, Minister of Health, Annette King, also had a finance portfolio, turned to Michael Cullen and famously said, for God's sake, Michael, Jim's destroyed every one of your argument. For God's sake, give him his bank. And Michael Cullen said, oh, okay. And we had our bank. to great jubilation and cheering throughout the country. But the troglodytes, the Treasury, the Round Table didn't stop. They had front people. It taught me a lot about some academics. One guy who's the banking public professor at Massey University, his name, interestingly, was Professor Tripe, but we had some fun with that. This bank will fail. It's no point. We've moved on. Banks are only for the private sector. There's no role for government, etc., etc., etc. And it was in the end facts. And well, but I say that on the post office board, they were leaking of their minutes by people who were disloyal, which shows you the importance of who put on these boards.
Yep, for sure.
And one of the Treasury, one of the Commonwealth is that's not a Commonwealth, but there's a Crown monitoring organization called CCMAU. It was supposed to do the work for the government on an objective basis. One of their members was leaking the reports to the right-wing parties, ACT and others. He was found out, and he was sacked or resigned or whatever he did. But that was the level. They had an enormous campaign against this, because those who had the right-wing agenda, the Margaret Thatcher Friedman agenda, they knew that this was going to be a powerful factual argument dragged out of the academics in those realms, because people could see, and we can go on to it, but it became an enormous success.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. They wanted it to fail, but you've seen it was a success. I've had a discussion with a director of the ANZ Bank at the time, who told me how flawed the board of the ANZ Bank was, at how much of a success it was. And so do you think have those people who tried to predict its failure, have they, aside from Helen Clark, who's probably has a certain amount of goodwill and is well-meaning, have some of those more entrenched people admitted they were wrong?
No, they never do. In fact, all they plan now is, and John Key is one of their who's now on, former Prime Minister, is now chair of the ANZ Bank here. He planned to sell it, but he met resistance from his own party. And he put up trial balloons. Let's do some partial privatization. Let mum and dad investor into the usual thing, and then mum and dad and investor was swallowed up by ANZ and the rest of them. But even his own party said, a bit like the nuclear policy, hey, don't even go there, it's unpopular, because it's popular with National Party voters as well.
So that's been Matt, that's been the success story, but now it's roughly 20 odd years into its existence. And I think this is an important part of the discussion for Australians as well, because I'd be interested in your views, given the way you don't get to manage the bank, governments of the day who don't share your views anymore are in charge of who manages the bank. So what do you think of its performance? What are its strengths and weaknesses, in your opinion, the way Kiwibank has operated, and how could it be improved if you were in charge?
A little bit of background there, because the strengths, the government put, I think, $60 million in New Zealand, 2001 dollars, so it's a lot more now. And then Cullen said, that's all you're getting. It was paid back within a year or two.
Wow.
We were told that only, it really shows you the elitist policies, only sort of deadbeats and beneficiaries classed as deadbeats and low income people would join this bank. So not your important people. Well, 800,000 people, New Zealanders, were members within 3 years, and we're a population of, at that time, 4.5 million people.
Yeah.
So that's enormous.
Yeah.
The bank started straight away being able to compete on fees. So the other banks had to lower their fees. Mortgage rates were down, services, upgraded technological services, better service, and so forth. And keeping branches open and opening new branches, a big winner everywhere, in national held seats as well as Labour seats everywhere. There was now a bank of the Kiwibank alongside the post shop. And it kept post shops open as well. We call them post shops, not post office. So there was that. a board was set up, but it was a success at first because the first chair was the former National Party Prime Minister, Jim Bolger. So a very clever move because
Right.
National Party came out guns firing when it was set up. This is a waste. This is the government. This is pandering to Jim Anderton and the tail wagging the dog, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
Discounting that the population wanted it. But we went to where Jim Bolger was the New Zealand ambassador in Washington, said, would you like to be the chair of the Kiwibank? Yes. And so National couldn't do anything because their own member,
Yep.
their own prime minister was the head. And a very good board was put in, so putting the board. And it went from strength to strength to strength as part of the plan of developing it as a tool alongside setting up a development finance corporation. That was our plan. But soon afterwards, different story, our party had an internal war and we disappeared from the scene. So another lesson there, there's another discussion.
Yeah.
So Labor loved it. In the 2005 election, they used it. But once the National Party came in, they said about the steps, it's still a public bank, but no longer does it have a board that's on board with developing it in the broader sense of what this bank should do. They've started joining with the other banks in closing branches, etc. So perhaps I can come to that side. The bank's a great success. It's a public bank still. It's in public hands, but there are weaknesses.
How much of a role did Jim Anderton and your alliance have to play in picking the original board?
A very big role, because the Labor Party were quite good about it. Jim decided he wouldn't push to be the minister in charge because it would be seen and it could be attacked. Here's Jim's bank again. Jim's running it. He wanted it to be seen as this is the property of the people. Any minister can be put in charge, competent minister can be in charge of it, and it's run straight down the line. It's not personal favors. He also didn't want to be seen as the person appointing people, that type of thing. But there's a process for putting people on board. So the decision to put Jim Bolger was both political, and Jim Bolger could do it. He had the ability to do it. Jim had a big role in that, and we all said, yeah, we like that. The other members chosen for their professionalism, but also their honesty and their agreement with what the aim of the bank was, the wider aim. So a very big part. And I say Labor were quite good in getting sign off on who should be appointed to the board. And of course, it's changed since, and the present board, I wouldn't appoint them.
So let's elaborate then, Matt, on the weaknesses and how you would improve it if you had a chance to.
I think it needs a charter. The bank. Well, two things. You can't. The problem is with all of these things, as you can see, what happened with the Chifley reforms, 45, and with your own Commonwealth Bank, and then particularly if your own side weakens the public goals and policies. Not a lot you can do. There you come to a second part, which is having a very strong political movement for the people.
Yeah.
And may I say, one of the bodies that can play a big part in this are trade unions, as the representatives of so many working people, to demand policies which are in protection of a public bank or whatever public institution it is. So I can only say that and also our party shouldn't have disappeared. We could have played a big part, but we still got a voice. We still got people and places. The thing to do now, it needs a public campaign, hands off our bank. We've got the bank, a bit like the BNZ when it was having financial difficulties and had made some stupid decisions before the 87 crash, publicly owned as it was, but it also had a right-wing board, and they bought into the right-wing agenda. Jim's argument at the time, when challenged on it, was say, well, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You change the board, you change this direction, you change the policies. And so with this bank, it needs the Labor Party at the moment having a look at the board, putting people on there who are committed to its public purposes, and perhaps strengthening it by the directions from the government, and then winning public support for those so that they're seen not just as a narrow political party, but a bit like you've got legislation to say what the Reserve Bank in New Zealand can do. Perhaps you need further legislation. That's all I can suggest at the moment, but it certainly needs the period afterwards to maintain the goals. And as I'm stressing, it's part of the economic toolkit of any progressive type of government for their people, needs to have policies that protect that public institution.
Yeah. So in conclusion, Matt, is New Zealand better off because it has a postal bank? And would your other country, Australia, benefit from having a postal bank?
On the question of New Zealand, undoubtedly so. Even those weaknesses I've suggested, and by the way, the bank cut off from the post office bank, another thing which was encouraged to standalone bank now, but it's best to keep it, the synergy with the post bank, as Germany has showed, one of the examples.
Okay.
It's a great synergy, but people have, despite the flaws, they have access to a bank which puts pressure on the other banks in terms of fees and keeping them honest, if you like.
Yeah.
So it does play a role in home mortgages and other things. A need to extend it into support for small businesses, local businesses, regional initiatives, but that's in the future. Would Australia benefit? Undoubtedly, because clearly development in Australia and rational development, and with all the needs of the states and within the states, and a bank which opens its branches is in tune with what the local needs are in terms of
That's right.
possibilities. What can they develop in that regions? What are their strengths? How can the banks put in long-term development loans? How can the bank work and feed back to government what's happening in their area? Any government worth its salt would liaise with the financial lending institution. What's coming to you? What is needed? What sort of ways should we cooperate? Both in your lending capacity and government's wider lending capacity for initiatives. So many benefits. It doesn't need the term is a rocket scientist to work it out. Just needs someone with a brain and goodwill towards the needs of the country. I mean, all politicians go on about our country and et cetera, et cetera. Well, here's where the rubber meets the road. In the needs of their communities, put in a financial institution, a bank based on your post offices, which already have a network across the country, to help to build those communities.
Well, Matt Robson, thank you very, very much for your information today, your observations, your advice for Australia. I'm quite excited by the potential of this discussion. I think people are going to learn a lot from it. Not least the fact that you can win these battles. This is, there's a this Tina idea. There is no alternative. People got politically brainwashed into this idea that you can't change it now. It is what it is. This is the system we've got. No, it's not working, and we've got to go back to something that does work. And your story about winning that politically, and then how a bank can actually function, is brilliant. Australia needs to learn from its little cousin across the ditch on this one. And thank you for being the person to help us do that as the right person, because you're an Aussie too. So we'll leave it there, Matt. I encourage the viewer, when you watch this show, get on the Citizens Party's website. You'll see all the material laid out there for the Australian campaign for a postal bank. Get excited from what Jim said. Understand that this is an achievable policy, and we will not stop until we have achieved it. So thanks, Matt.
My pleasure.